I'm happy to have invited Martin Kulldoff, who is a professor, who is Swedish and was close to my home in Denmark, and has come today to visit me so we can discuss the COVID-19 pandemic together. Above all, we are going to discuss if the draconian lockdowns have done more good than harm, or if they have actually been harmful for our citizens. So welcome, Martin, and please explain who you are.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you for inviting me to your home, your lovely home. So I'm a biostatistician and an epidemiologist. I am a professor of medicine at Harvard, currently on leave. And I'm also one of the co-founders with J. Bhattacharya and Scott Atlas of the Academy for Science and Freedom.
And maybe the same two persons that you wrote the Great Barrington Declaration with?
Not exactly, though J. Bhattacharya was one of the three co-authors.
Oh yeah, Gupta was the third one.
Yeah, Dr. Suneta Gupta at Oxford University. She was the third one.
Yes, so you can really start where you want, but the Great Barrington Declaration was really important, I think.
Thank you. Well, it's a one-page document, and of all the scientific things I've written, it's probably the one that's least novel. It's based on long-standing principles of public health. But it was frustrating as a person who'd been working with infectious diseases and studying infectious disease outbreaks for a few decades, when suddenly countries around the world started to lock down, breaking fundamental principles of public health that we have known about for a long time. For example, if you have a disease, if you have public health, you cannot focus on one single disease all the time, only like COVID. You have to consider potential harms from your measures. So when you close schools, there's harms to that. So the lockdowns create a lot of collateral public health damage, not just on education for children, but on cardiovascular disease outcomes, on cancer, screening and treatment, on diabetes care, on mental health among both young and the old. So there were enormous public health damage from the lockdowns.
Could I just intervene here?
Yeah.
Because Harland Krumholz is a cardiologist at Yale in the US, whom I know. I visited him once. And Harland wrote that it's strange that they now saw far fewer patients with a suspicion of a heart attack or a blood clot in their brains, which we call stroke, than they did before the COVID-19 pandemic. So he concluded that a lot of people stayed at home with these symptoms of a dangerous blood clot because they were afraid of getting infected with COVID-19 if they went to hospital. So when you say that there is collateral damage, this was surely one of the collateral damages, that there must have been more people dying when they stayed at home because we have life-saving treatments for these blood clots.
Exactly. And I think there were more deaths at home, at least in the UK, and I think in other countries as well.
Yes.
And those are things we see sort of during the pandemic. But if we look at cancer, for example, if people don't get there were less cancer diagnosed during the pandemic. That's not because there was less cancer, it was just wasn't found.
Yes.
And if you don't diagnose the cancer, so you can't treat it properly. So, but that doesn't influence the mortality in the short term. But maybe a woman now, for example, who didn't maybe get the cervical cancer screening, she might now die 3 to 5 years from now instead of living another 10, 20 years. So those are long-term things that we're going to have to live with and die with for many decades.
Yes. When shortly after the pandemic started in December 2019 in Wuhan in China and quickly spread to the whole world, just some 4 months, no, it was more, it was actually 10 months later that you published the Great Barrington Declaration. And when I saw that declaration, I really liked it. It was very short, less than 600 words, and there were no references to the scientific literature, but what you wrote was kind of common sense based on many decades of research in epidemiology and infectious diseases, and it made a lot of sense to me what you wrote there. And just 2 weeks later, there came an opposing thing called the John Snow Memorandum, which was published in The Lancet. We will come back to that, but will you first tell me and the audience a little about the Great Barrington Declaration?
So one of the key features of the pandemic, which we knew of already in the beginning of 2020 from Wuhan, is that while anybody can get infected, there's more than 1,000-fold difference in the risk of dying from COVID if you are old versus young. So for old people in the 70s, 80s, 90s, COVID is a very serious disease posing a lot of risk. For children, not so much, because there's less risk for children from COVID than from the typical annual influenza season. So the logical thing to do then is we have to do our very, very best to protect older, high-risk people. And we failed doing that. And I think a lot of older people died because we didn't protect them sufficiently. At the same time, the collateral damage from lockdowns on children and young adults are enormous. So we should not disrupt their lives. We should let them live close to normal lives, to go to school, to participate in sports, to have cultural events, to visit with relatives and so on, and be socialized with their friends. So that's the premises of the Great Barrington Declaration, that we needed to do a better job protecting older high-risk people while letting children and young adults live normal lives. And most countries did not follow that, unfortunately.
Perhaps not anyone apart from Sweden.
So Sweden, I think, would be the closest.
Yes.
And I think Sweden was heavily criticized in 2020.
Oh, yes.
Sweden didn't close the schools for children aged 1 to 15, for example, never.
Yeah.
And that was the right decision. Sweden protecting its children and gave them the education that need. And if there's one thing in this pandemic that I would like to change, if I only could change one thing, is to have kept the schools open for all children throughout the pandemic. We knew already from Sweden that in the spring of 2020, when the schools were open in Sweden, there are 1.8 million children ages 1 to 15 and children who went to school throughout. And among them, how many people do you think died that spring of 2020 from COVID? Exactly 0 children. There were a few hospitalizations, but no deaths.
Yes.
And they also looked at the teachers, and the teachers didn't have any higher risk than other professions. So it was very clear that it was completely safe in terms of COVID to keep the schools open. And the Swedish kids didn't wear masks at school, so they sort of spent the time in school normally. They were told to stay home if they felt sick, whatever it was, but that was it.
I remember there was this study that documented that school teachers were not at greater risk than other people. And there was a guy, the primary author, I think, who was terribly harassed for his honest scientific findings. He published it somewhere and people got very angry.
Yeah, and it was also to some extent ignored, because in July, so this report from the Swedish and Finnish actually health public health agencies came out in June of 2020, I believe it was. And about a month later, New England Journal of Medicine published an article discussing whether schools should be open or not. And they didn't even bother to mention the results from Sweden, which was the only country that kept them open. So that's like doing like a trial of a new drug and not having a placebo comparison group. And that was published in New England Journal of Medicine.
Yes, yes.
So in the spring of 2020, I was unable to publish my thoughts about the different risk by age in the United States, in English media there. I was able to publish in Sweden to support the Swedish strategy in the major newspapers, but in the US I had no success until August of 2020, when I was able to publish in CNN arguing for schools to be open, but it was CNN Español in Spanish because I write Spanish. The English edition didn't want that particular article. So there was a lot of frustration among me and many other scientists, who most of my colleagues who I talked to on a personal basis agree with me that this focus protection would be the right way. But there was a lot of very frustration that not to get out with a message. So in October of 2020, I invited Dr. J. Bhattacharya from Stanford and Dr. Gupta from Oxford to come to Massachusetts in the United States. And while we were there, we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration. And before that, people who have spoken out has been dismissed. It's only one person, or they're not an infectious disease epidemiologist, or whatever. There was always some excuse why we shouldn't listen to them. But the fact that there were three of us, so what we wrote was nothing that other people hadn't already said before. But what made it impossible for them to ignore it was that there were three of us instead of only one. We had all done work in infectious disease technology for a long, long time. And we all came from reasonably respectable universities, Stanford, Harvard, and Oxford.
Yeah.
And then it was impossible for them to ignore it.
What you have started to describe now is the horrible censorship that was introduced during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we will come back to that a little later here. But before we do that, I want to say that I published a book about vaccines in the beginning of the pandemic, where I wrote that deaths from COVID-19 were considerably higher in Sweden than in Norway and Denmark, where we had lockdowns and recommended face masks and so on. But then as time went by, I followed the numbers, and the differences just became smaller and smaller. And you said it takes some years before the collateral damage really becomes visible in the statistics. And you know, when there is a pandemic, it kills in two ways. It kills because of the infection, and it kills because of the disruption that is caused by the pandemic, in this case, the lockdowns and other measures. That also has some lethal effects.
Very much so, yes.
Yeah, so what you really need is, and of course you know that, to look at what is the total mortality before COVID-19, during COVID-19, and now that we don't have that much COVID-19. And when you look at the total mortality, you have something that is called excess mortality. How many more people died during the pandemic than before the pandemic? And when you look at these numbers, several studies have been published now. They consistently show that Sweden, that did not mandate face masks, and virtually no one used face masks, and you had an open society, you have one of the lowest excess mortalities in the Western world. So we now have the proof that what Sweden did was absolutely the correct thing to do. Do you agree, Martin?
I agree. And excess mortality is the best metric
Yes.
to look at. And from 2020 to 2022, you're right that Sweden has the lowest or one of the lowest excess mortality, depending exactly on what method is used. But
Yes.
I've seen where it's actually the very lowest.
Yeah.
And that's another principle of public health is you can't just look at it short term. Because yes, if suppose you want to minimize COVID death in the very short term, yeah, you can just close down everything for a little while. But you're just pushing the pandemic into the future. And for any knowledgeable infectious disease epidemiologist, in the beginning of 2020, when COVID hit northern Italy and Iran, which were the two areas outside of China where it sort of was a major hit first, it was completely obvious that this virus is going to reach every corner of the world, sooner or later.
Yes.
It's just a question of how fast we can push it forward in time a little bit, but that doesn't prevent the pandemic eventually from coming.
There is another factor I want to bring to the table about Sweden, which I really admire, that in Sweden you had the state epidemiologist Anders Tegnell, and his advice was respected by the politicians, and he consistently told people not to lock down Sweden. And I have seen a documentary about Tegnell that at one point where Sweden had much more mortality from COVID-19 than Denmark and Norway, for example, he was heavily criticized in the media and had a very tough time. I think some people even called him a murderer and whatever people can do when they are frustrated and afraid. People were afraid. And Tegnell was right. And in all other countries I have looked at, you had all these experts by the day, that suddenly some people came up and were viewed by the media as experts, even though many of them were not experts. And the politicians listened to them. And as far as I can see, this was a disaster.
So Anders Tegnell did a great job in Sweden, and Johan Giesecke also contributed, I think.
That was before, he was the chief epidemiologist before him.
Yeah, so he was a retired
Yes.
state epidemiologist, but he came back and sort of helped with the reasoning, I think. So what Sweden did, I think, was right, and there was a time actually, a couple of weeks, I think it was in April of 2020, where Sweden had the highest COVID mortality in the world.
Yes, I remember.
But at that time, they stood fast with the right policy, and
Yeah.
I had no doubt that this was a temporary thing, and that Sweden would turn out to have done the right thing. But if you look at the United States, so Anders Tegnell had a lot of experience with infectious diseases. He also worked in Africa where there are many infectious diseases. So that's a contrast to the leading voices in the United States, like Anthony Fauci, Robert Redfield, Deborah Birx, and Rochelle Walensky in the current administration, who they're like immunologists and virologists. Like Fauci is the lab scientist, and with very limited knowledge of public health. And the knowledge of public health they had was from all four of them have their expertise in HIV/AIDS. So the little they knew about public health was actually from HIV/AIDS, which is a very different virus to COVID-19.
Oh yeah.
With very different approaches to, so for example, contact tracing. For some infectious diseases, that's a very important thing to do as public health. Like Ebola or sexually transmitted diseases, for example. But to think that would work for influenza or COVID is just crazy.
This is a very important lesson. There are so many important lessons. And one of them is that you should not listen to pseudo-experts who are really not experts in what they are talking about. They might be brilliant in other areas of research, but you should find people who really know what they are talking about. And this was a huge failure, as you have said, not only in the US, but also in other countries, in fact.
And you have to let different scientists debate each other.
Oh, yes.
So there's a story from the Second World War where Winston Churchill would have different generals with different opinions. They will argue with each other in front of Churchill, and then he will make a decision based on that. But he will have different voices or different opinions there.
Yes.
But that discussion among scientists were closed down. If you did not agree with what Fauci and in England Jeremy Farrar and Wallace and Whitty, and in Germany Christian Drosten, if you didn't agree with this small group, small clique of virologists, etc., then you weren't allowed to speak up, and you were silenced or censored or slandered. And I think that was devastating, because you have to have that debate. And that's something where Sweden was different also, because there was a vigorous debate in the major newspapers. There was the group of 22 who were very critical of Anders Tegnell and his approach.
Oh, yes.
They were very vocal about it. And I disagree with them. I think they were completely wrong, but I'm very happy that they spoke up and that they were allowed to publish in the major newspapers, because that allowed me to actually respond to them and other colleagues.
Yes.
And to have that debate in the for the public in the mainstream media in Sweden, I think was very, very important for Sweden.
I have something I would like to read aloud here. That after you published the Great Barrington Declaration, it took only 10 days before the John Snow Memorandum was published in the Lancet. And I wrote about this John Snow Memorandum in my book, The Chinese Virus Killed Millions and Scientific Freedom. I wrote, the John Snow Memorandum was published in the Lancet. It is 945 words with 8 references. It is seriously manipulative. There are factual inaccuracies, and several references are to highly unreliable science. The authors claim that SARS-CoV-2 has high infectivity, and that the infection fatality rate of COVID-19 is several-fold higher than that of seasonal influenza. Both claims are wrong, and the 2 references they use are to studies that have used modeling, which is highly bias-prone, instead of real data. So, to me, this was a disaster. And they also claim that transmission of the virus can be mitigated through the use of face masks with no reference. And this is also wrong. We will come back to this. The vitriolic attacks have almost exclusively been directed against those supporting the ideas in the Great Barrington Declaration, and not those who supported major lockdowns. And I believe this is psychological. When people are afraid, they are glad that governments do something for them. And they could really see something was done when societies were closed down. And then ordinary people think, oh, that's great. We cannot infect each other if we don't meet. And this is, of course, also correct. But as you said, ultimately the pandemic will hit almost everyone.
And government was also part of making people afraid.
Oh, yes.
And of course, the media, journalists were part of that whole process. And I think one of the principles of public health is not to do that. You want to give accurate information about what the risks are and accurate advice. That wasn't done. People there were purpose effort to make people scared.
Yes.
In order to make them behave according to what the governments wanted them to do. Now, with that memorandum in Lancet, I prefer to call it the Lancet Memorandum because John Snow was a great epidemiologist working on cholera. Yes. So I think it's unfair to him to put his name on that memorandum. So I prefer to call it the Lancet Memorandum. One thing that they did there was they're questioning national immunity after having been infected by COVID. And to me, that's astonishing. At the time, we already knew that if you had been infected, there was a very, very low risk of getting infected again and dying from COVID or so. And we've known about national national immunity for 2,500 years, since 430 BC during the Athenian plague. So that you have prominent scientists, prominent epidemiologists questioning whether there were immunity after having recovered from COVID, I think was quite astonishing. And of course, there are some infections that you give you lifelong immunity, like if you have measles, for example. And then the others, like the coronaviruses, including the 4 commonly circulating coronaviruses, where it's not lifelong, but you have protection against severe disease down the road. So that's what you would expect. That latter is what you would expect from COVID-19 when it came. And I think that's also what has been proven right after many years. You can get it again, but you will not get severely ill a second time. So for them to question national immunity, I think, was quite astonishing. And that led to a lot of bad policies, including mandating vaccines for people who had already had COVID, forcing young people to take the vaccine when there were older people who hadn't been vaccinated yet, who needed it. So to me, that was the biggest thing that was quite extraordinary in that Lancet Memorandum.
There were so many things that were wrong. The idea that you should take booster after booster of the COVID-19 vaccines, even though you had already had 2 vaccinations. And the European Medicines Agency actually got cold feet at one point in time, where they warned against getting all these boosters because there were indications that this could actually be harmful to the immune system. So there are many things that have not been properly investigated, and the many boosters are definitely among them.
Yeah, and there hasn't been any randomized clinical trials on the boosters to see if it actually prevents death or severe disease.
Yeah.
But the same was true actually of the mRNA vaccines when they came out. They, I think it was in November and December of 2020 that the clinical trials came out, and they showed a large reduction in symptomatic disease. But they were not designed to actually find out whether they reduced death.
No.
Or reduced hospitalizations.
No.
And so they were not designed either to look at transmission, reducing transmission. And I don't want to seem heartless, but to be honest, I don't really care if somebody had the sniffles for a few days in terms of symptomatic disease. What I do care about is that people don't die from COVID.
Oh, yes.
And that they don't get hospitalized.
Yeah.
But most of the participants in these randomized trials were young adults.
Yes.
And they won't die no matter what.
Yeah.
Whether they have the vaccine or not, they will survive.
Yeah.
So they should have enrolled instead more older people, and then we could have answered the question of whether these vaccines actually reduced mortality or not. Now there are observational studies that have shown that in 2021 in older people it reduced mortality. But there should also have been randomized trials to do that, and there were none. So that was a failure by both the pharmaceutical companies and FDA not to run those trials with proper endpoints.
The clinical trials were not powered to study mortality or COVID-19 mortality, but what they did show was a big difference in hospitalizations, where it was a good idea to be vaccinated compared to not being vaccinated. So my view on that was that this would likely also lead to a drop in mortality to be vaccinated. But of course you are right that this has never been shown in randomized trials.
So one thing that a Danish scientist, Christine Stable-Ben, and her colleagues did was brilliant, because she took and combined the results from the clinical trials from all the mRNA vaccines, and then the Pfizer and Moderna, and then she combined the adenovirus vaccines, the AstraZeneca and J&J, and I think Sputnik, and looked at mortality from those. Now it's still mostly young adults, but from the mRNA vaccine there was no decline in mortality from the vaccine. So basically showing that for younger adults there was no mortality benefit. There was a confidence interval, so there could have been a limited in one way or the or limited benefit or limited harm. For the AstraZeneca and J&J vaccines there was a reduction in mortality for this age group. But of course still we want the vaccine for older people, and there were not enough older people in the clinical trials to know from them, and there the observational data shows that there was a mortality benefit also.
I agree with you that her results are very interesting, also because the adenovirus vaccines could perhaps be viewed as live attenuated vaccines, because the adenovirus is live. And Christine and her husband Peter Åby have shown that live attenuated vaccines like the measles vaccine, they reduce mortality by much more than their specific effect on measles, for example. So the immune system is trained in some unspecific way that actually is beneficial towards other infections if you use live attenuated vaccines, whereas if you use non-live vaccines, they found the opposite, that they increase mortality, total mortality. So these observations are very disturbing, and we must have more research in these areas. They have also shown that if you use both live vaccines and non-live vaccines to people, it's important to end with a live attenuated vaccine in order to have the best effect on mortality. And they have shown that there is a gender difference, that the people who are dying are females. So there are lots of things we don't know where we need more research.
Yes, I think that the research that they have done, I think they're the most important vaccine scientists in the world today.
I agree.
And the research they've done for a couple of decades now is just amazingly and very, very strong and very important. And they've done a lot of this in Africa. So when they look at mortality, for example, the randomized trial of the polio vaccine, and people don't die of polio in Africa. So when they saw a reduction in total mortality among these children, it was obviously due to other things than polio.
Yes.
So that's the benefit of this live vaccine. And then they found, as you said, the opposite from, for example, the DTP vaccine, which is a non-live vaccine.
DTP, that is a vaccine against diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis.
Correct, yeah.
Yeah.
And the one that they studied in Africa is different from the vaccine that we use in the United States.
Okay.
Which is the DTaP vaccine.
Yeah. There is one thing I want to add, because I said earlier that what they said in the John Snow memorandum, that the COVID-19 vaccine, no, not vaccine, virus, was more deadly than influenza. And I said, this is not correct. This is an issue I have studied, and it has been studied by John Ioannidis from Stanford University. And the fact is that how deadly a virus is depends a lot on two things. What is the level of immunity in the population before the virus appears? Secondly, how close do people live together? Because if they live closely together, the infectious dose might be too high so that people die before they can mount an immune response. And I always use the experience from the Faroe Islands in the North Atlantic almost 200 years ago. There came a measles epidemic to the Faroe Islands at a point in time where they had not had measles for 60, 70 years. And the death rate was 10 times bigger than when we had measles epidemics in Denmark. This was because there was no immunity in the population. So we have a situation with COVID-19 that there was very little immunity towards this virus, which is one reason that it appeared so deadly. But it was not a property of the virus itself. It depended on the lack of general immunity in the population. This is important to understand.
Yeah, and the virus is never going to go away. We're going to live with this virus forever as an endemic state.
Yes.
But it will be similar to other coronaviruses that we live with consistently. So we will get a cold, and
Yes.
then we'll recover from it because we have good immunity.
Yeah.
And then maybe when we are 87 years old, that virus or something else, when we have a weakened immune system, may end our lives. But that's just like our viruses that we live with.
Martin, could we switch to face masks? Do you want to say a little about that?
Sure. So there has been basically two studies, randomized studies on face masks for COVID. One was in Denmark, I think it was called the DanMask study, and found that they looked at people randomized to wear a mask or not, and those who wear a mask did not have less infections from COVID. So there was a null result. And then there was another for wearing a mask, but that doesn't tell us anything from those who, if the person wearing the mask will protect other people from it. So there was, to answer that question, there was a randomized study in Bangladesh where they randomized whole villages to either wear masks or not wearing masks. And they found a reduction in infection from COVID somewhere between 0 and 18% reduction. So either it was useless or very marginal, limited efficacy. And whichever of those is true, if you push a measure saying this will protect you, that's actually dangerous. Because you have older people who are at high risk from COVID. You don't want them to expose themselves by going to crowded restaurants. They should be careful. And then if you tell them, wear a mask and you'll be safe.
Yeah.
That is a dangerous thing. And there were people in the United States and presumably other countries who thought they were protected by the mask. They would do things, older people, they would do things they shouldn't have done.
Yeah.
And they died because of this.
Yeah.
So this message of mask, it wasn't just that they were promoting something that was useless or mostly useless. They were actually harming people by making people believe that they were protected when they were not. And you don't do that in public health. Absolutely not.
There is another thing about the Bangladesh study that you mentioned, the relative reduction in risk. What is more important is the absolute reduction in risk. And the difference between the mask group and the non-mask group was only 1%. So only 1% less got infected when they wore a mask. But those villages that were told to wear a mask, they were better at keeping distance to other people. So those who kept the distance to other people, there was a difference of 5%. And of course, this is good prevention, not to come too close to other people. So the difference of 5% could easily explain the minute difference of 1% in getting infected. So my conclusion on the Bangladesh study is that it shows absolutely nothing. It is essentially a negative result because of this bias.
Yeah, so it could be that the reduction, the tiny reduction that they saw was not due to the mask itself. It was because people were afraid to put more distance from somebody that they saw wearing a mask.
Yes. So I had great problems with this mask mandate that we also had in Denmark, to dress whole populations like bank robbers, so that we don't recognize people we usually recognize. We don't know who is hidden behind a mask, and we cannot see their full facial expressions, which are important for social interactions. To code, is this guy friendly or not, or is he joking, or what is going on? And
it was great for bank robbers. And there were bank robbers in the US who used that.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. No, that was really crazy, to mandate almost the whole world to wear face masks.
But there were some very silly studies in the US that were used to promote masks. There was one that was that New York Times were propagating. There was from North Carolina, a study by Duke. They had looked at schools.
Yeah.
And all the schools had mask mandate in North Carolina, but there were very few cases of COVID. So they assumed that, okay, because there were so few cases and there were masks, it must be because of masks that they kept it so low. But I think that actually all these children were not only wearing masks, they were also wearing shoes. So I think that maybe it was the shoes who kept the COVID low instead of the masks. At least that's the same logic in those two things.
Yeah, now you're joking, just to be clear.
Yes, I'm joking.
Okay, but this is the problem with observational studies, where you don't randomize people to do something or not do something. Then these two groups are different in all sorts of respects.
Well, in this case, they didn't even have a comparison group.
Yeah,
so that's even worse.
Even worse, yeah. Now we have discussed vaccines and masks and major lockdowns. But there is one thing that it would be strange if we did not talk about at all. And that is, why did millions of people die from an infection which, in my mind, not only was a lab escape from a laboratory in Wuhan, but highly likely was even manufactured there. So it was very dangerous research that was carried out at the Wuhan laboratory. And I know that this is not perhaps your key expertise area, but I will ask you, what do you think, do you have any view about the origin of COVID-19?
So I'm a public health scientist, I'm not a virologist, so I know about clinical trials, I know about observational studies, about vaccines, about public health measures like lockdowns and those things. I'm not a virologist, so I can't judge whether this might have been manufactured or not. And I prefer not to voice my views on things that is not my scientific expertise. What I can say, I think, is that it's very disturbing how the discussion of whether this was a natural or lab leak or not was closed down again by Lancet, who published a paper by some prominent virologists claiming that any thoughts of it being a lab leak was a conspiracy theory. So they were trying to shut down the debate. And we now know that they actually didn't even believe that themselves. They were very much concerned that it was a lab leak. We know that from some Slack messages that they communicated with each other. And we know it was orchestrated by people at the very highest level in government, people, Anthony Fauci, Francis Collins, the head of NIH, and Jeremy Farrar, the head of Wellcome Trust in the UK. So they were very dishonest, trying to shut down this discussion to find out what caused this pandemic. And that's very disturbing just by itself, no matter whether it was a lab leak or not. Just that trying to close down that debate is very disturbing. That's not how we do science. And they should not be scientists if they don't accept open discussions about these things.
it was incredibly embarrassing for Lancet, which many people consider a prestigious journal, that they allowed these people to write, for example, "We stand together to strongly condemn conspiracy theories suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin. Excuse me, this is pure bullshit. It has nothing to do with conspiracies to find out why a pandemic killed millions of people. This we call science." And they even had a petition where you could send in your signature in order to support the idea that nobody did anything wrong. This was a natural origin of this virus. And when I looked up where you could sign this petition, there were more than 20,000 people who had signed it. And then I saw a comment, "Fuck you, Daszak." And I thought, my goodness, Daszak was a British researcher living in America who has been instrumental in these very dangerous gain-of-function experiments in Wuhan. And he was behind this piece in Lancet. So someone was very angry about this. And the next time I looked up the petition website, this comment was gone. So likely it was a robot that had just pulled out the two most recent comments and with no moderation, but someone found out that this was not so flattering for these people.
Yes, the scientists are embarrassed on behalf of scientists.
Oh yes.
That there are scientists who engage in this kind of dishonest, unscientific behavior, and they should not be scientists anymore.
No. And then it only took a very short while before Christian Andersen and colleagues published something in Nature Medicine that was similarly embarrassing. And Andersen was highly active on social media, where he condemned the lab leak theory and confronted its proponents by tweeting that any type of lab origin would have to involve a massive conspiracy. This is total nonsense. We have known about lab leaks for decades. Even the smallpox vaccine escaped from a laboratory, and we have had escapes from China before. Also, other SARS viruses escaped from Chinese laboratories. This is what happens, and the safety precautions in Wuhan were not adhered to. They had a safety level that corresponds to a dentist office, and not these moon men-like dresses that they were supposed to wear, because it took double as long to do their experiments that way. So the safety was criticized by US people who inspected these laboratories before the pandemic broke out. So now things have started to change, because scientists have now called on Nature Medicine to actually retract this horrible paper by Christian Andersen from March 2020, because they presented absolutely no evidence no credible evidence for their idea that this could not have been a lab leak, and this could not have been a manufactured virus in the laboratory.
Yeah, and at the same time as they were doing this, they were slandering scientists who were questioning them. Christian Andersen were on Twitter calling a young scientist that haven't even taken kindergarten biochemistry, or kindergarten virology. I forgot which one it was, and that's as scientist, you don't do that kind of slandering. That's bullying.
Yeah.
And that's just a way of closing down debate and making other people scared of speaking up.
There is another piece of news that I saw just the other day. that Christian Andersen and his co-author Robert Gary both lied to Congress during the House hearing about whether they had pending federal grants controlled by Anthony Fauci that could have been used to influence them. Because in the beginning, Christian Andersen expressed great doubts to Fauci, and he actually worried that this could be a lab leak. But he quickly turned around for no good reason and adopted the exact opposite attitude, bullying everybody who had another opinion than it being a natural occurrence. But the virus, the genome of the virus, is nowhere near the genome of the bats that you find in Wuhan. But it is.
Well, the bats are actually not in Wuhan. They're very far away from Wuhan also.
That's what I was going to say, that the closest relative of the genome of this virus you will find 1,500 kilometers away in a cave where the Wuhan researchers repeatedly went and collected bat feces in order to do their very dangerous experiments. So everything you look at, in my view, tells me that in contrast to the WHO inspection to Wuhan, which was a total farce, that ended with a statement that it was extremely unlikely that it was a lab leak. Absolutely no evidence for this statement. I have come to the conclusion it was extremely likely that it was a lab leak, and also very likely that the virus was actually manufactured, because they did gain-of-function experiments in order to make dangerous viruses. So they played with fire formally to be better prepared for the next pandemic so they could produce vaccines. But I think they created a pandemic themselves.
Psychologically, that might also be why they try to suppress it with these lockdowns, because they maybe suspected that they were responsible for it. But whether it's natural origin or a lab leak, the public health measures you take shouldn't depend on that. They're independent on what caused the pandemic.
Yes.
So lockdowns are wrong whether or not it was a lab leak or not. Closing schools were wrong whether or not it was a lab leak or not, and so on.
That's true, but one reason I'm so interested in the origin of the pandemic is that I have argued again and again in articles that the WHO should call for a total ban on these hugely dangerous experiments. And I have seen absolutely no authority calling for a ban on these experiments, apart from the United States government during Barack Obama, that stopped these experiments for a while, but then Donald Trump came to office.
Yeah, they were stopped for a while, and then they came back.
Yes. I believe these experiments should be stopped because they have produced nothing of value, but highly likely have killed around 7 million people. Because if they had not done these experiments, then why would they go to the caves 1,500 kilometers away and go back and manipulate the viruses? It wouldn't have happened.
Yep.
So the last thing I wanted to mention is that the US media were disgraceful microphone holders during this whole pandemic. They swallowed all the lies and the non-documented, terribly wrong statements from those who had the power or those who wanted to protect both the United States and China from becoming too embarrassed about what they had done in collaboration, because some of China's gain-of-function experiments were funded by the National Institutes of Health, which was initially denied by Anthony Fauci, who was presidential advisor, I think, for 4 presidents in US history. He later had to admit that he was wrong there.
So if you go back to the media, so after the Great Barrington Declaration, I was interviewed quite a lot, so the silencing sort of ended there. But it was interesting to observe the media in different countries, because in the UK and the US, in the English language media, the mainstream media was very hostile. They would be very aggressive and try to slander you or smear you. Or the more smaller media would be very supportive, and that's of course always nice, but they were very supportive. But when I had interviews with media from the non-English speaking countries, Latin America or India or Spain and so on, they asked very hard questions, but very good questions. And those are actually the interviews I like the best, because they force you to defend what you said. So there was definitely a difference in the media from the English-speaking countries versus the non-English-speaking countries.
Do you have any idea why the journalists in our part of the world did so terribly badly, also according to what they had been taught at journalism schools?
I don't know. It's tragic, because we need good journalism, and there's so much journalism that's now it's not journalism anymore. It's just parroting a narrative, or establishment narrative.
Maybe we should mention that both you and I are involved with institutes that try to defend scientific freedom and freedom of speech. And this is important, I think. So your institute is called?
The Academy for Science and Freedom.
The Academy for Science and Freedom.
Yeah.
Yeah, and mine is called Institute for Scientific Freedom. So it's pretty close, and we have just discussed collaborating with each other, because science is under, and honesty is under huge pressure in the Western world right now.
We have to reform the way science operates, the scientific community operates. There's now a lot of distrust in scientists, and for good reasons. I don't trust scientific community anymore. I want to read it myself. There are certain scientists I trust, but I don't trust what comes out from CDC or FDA anymore.
No.
So we have to reform how...
So I should just say CDC means Centers for Disease
Control
Prevention and Control.
Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the United States.
Yeah. A US agency.
And FDA is the Food and Drug Administration, who decides what drugs or vaccines would be approved or not.
Yeah.
So we need to reform how science operates. We need to reform how the funding is done, how scientific journal operates, and how promotions are done. So one interesting observation during the pandemic is that the big powerhouses of science, the US and the UK, they were actually not where the most important COVID studies came early on. It came from other countries like Denmark, we mentioned the mask study, from Iceland, Israel, Sweden, Qatar, for example. All had some of the first studies on vaccine efficacy or natural immunity and those things. So they came, a lot of the good early studies came from the fringe of the scientific community. So like countries with, rich countries would have good scientists, but who is not as dependent on the funding mechanisms of NIH or the Wellcome Trust. And I think we need to decentralize how science operates. We can't have somebody like one person like Fauci who sits on the biggest pile of infectious disease research money in the world, and nobody dares to say anything that contradicts him.
No.
And the same with Wellcome Trust, Jeremy Farrar, and the Gates Foundations with Bill Gates. So we have to decentralize how science is funded.
Could I just say that some of the most important science of great value for patients and public health that I have ever done was completely unfunded, because the funders couldn't see how important this research was. So but that's for another talk. There is a lot to discuss there.
But that's true for actually many scientists. In the US, more scientists are funded by soft money from grants. So what scientists do is they have certain grants that pay their salary, so they have to do that. But then what they really want to study might not be funded, so then they do that also on the side.
Yes.
So that's very, very common among me and my colleagues.
Yes.
So you're not the only one in that situation.
Yeah.
And that's because to get funding, you have to, it can't be too innovative, I think. It has to be more mainstream.
Yes.
So, and that's not a good thing for science, that you have to sort of wear these two hats.
No. Maybe we are done, Martin. Is there anything you think you wanted to say you haven't said?
No, it's wonderful to have these frank scientific discussions, and lovely talking to you.
This is the first time Martin and I ever meet, but I look much forward to collaborating with you.
Likewise.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you. Mange tak.